You got to make the world you live in a better place. And that matters. The rest of it will come as a matter of fact.
We're going to talk to you today about accessibility and inclusive innovation as part of the Global Innovation Forum's Spark series.
My responsibility is to try to understand what does it mean to have a disability in Africa or the Middle East or Europe or even Wales, and bring it inside to Google so we can try to understand how to make our products and platforms and services more inclusive. I have a lot of experience of breaking stupid things and hopefully making things better. I discovered accessibility at Google because my product wasn't accessible. Having a disability isn't disabling if you have the right kit, if you have the right solution. People don't need to be fixed. They just need to be understood and accommodated for. What really helps is sincerity and transparency in the process. We're trying, we're learning, we welcome your feedback. We are inspired by the community, inspired by competition, and always trying to make things better. The problem is if you value numbers, you don't value people. People aren't numbers. Supporting the people with disabilities in terms of brand, in terms of product quality, because of the thoughtfulness you go in terms of building a more inclusive product, makes a better product.
We have to see it as a creative challenge, not a challenge to creativity. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Marianne Waite, and I'm the Director of Inclusivity at Interbrand Global. And I'm here with Christopher Patnoe, who's going to introduce himself in a minute. But we're going to talk to you today about accessibility and inclusive innovation as part of the Global Innovation Forum's Spark series. And as I say, I'm joined by Christopher Patnoe, Google powerhouse. So Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Christopher. I lead accessibility and disability inclusion for EMEA. So this means my responsibility is to try to understand what does it mean to have a disability in Africa or the Middle East or Europe or even Wales, and bring it inside to Google so we can try to understand how to make our products and platforms and services more inclusive. I have a lot of experience of breaking stupid things and hopefully making things better.
Amazing. Thanks, Chris. And you're currently in London as well, aren't you?
I am. Yeah, I'm not from here, as you can tell. I moved here to do this work.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, do you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that brought you here? Because that's kind of an interesting journey in itself.
Yeah, I'll just tell sort of the background, the 30-second version. So I'm a failed musician. I studied classical music, opera in uni, and I realized in my mid-20s I was making more money waiting on tables than I was singing, and thought it probably meant something. But fortunately, I was born and raised in Cupertino, California. So within a year of joining tech, I was at Apple, where I worked for 10 years on the first iPod, the first iTunes, the G4 and G5 towers, Final Cut Studios, where I met my wife, and spent a couple years at Sony making phones, a year at Disney making games, and I've been at Google now for 12 and a half years. And I discovered accessibility at Google because my product wasn't accessible. We had a test engineer come into one of our meetings. She turned on voiceover, and I heard button, 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 button. I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, this is Google Play Music for someone who's blind." I said, "Well, that's stupid. How do they use it?" I said, "They don't. That's why I'm here." So that was my introduction. It was because my product wasn't accessible. And then I never thought of it. My grandparents were just old. They weren't deaf. I'm just bad at spelling and processing data. I never thought about dyslexia. So but I couldn't look away. So within a couple of months, I volunteered to take on accessibility for the Google Play. And then a couple of years later, I started doing it for all of Google, where we built accessibility teams. And then here comes COVID. In the middle of COVID, I turned 50 and had this epiphany that I'd spent my whole life in the Bay Area, and I needed a change. So I pitched my job to my boss. I said, "Send me to Europe to get us ready for the European Accessibility Act." Well, she said yes, her boss said yes, her boss said yes. So we moved in 2021 at the height of COVID, and now we are proud Londoners. You can have the most innovative feature in an app or on a website, but if the rest of it isn't accessible, the community is not going to get to it. So I think of compliance as sort of like manure. It's something that you use to help something interesting grow. You have to do it. You have to have the materials to nurture. You have to care for the garden. So you need to care for your application, make sure it is basically compliant. There's no such thing as perfection, but build that process so your application or experience is compliant. And in doing so, you start building up the relationship with the community. So you get to learn what's interesting, what's broken. You get to understand how the technology works in new and interesting ways. And together with that manure on the ground, you have the opportunity and the experience and the environment that can promote innovation. You need all of these things together to really create something that's meaningful. You need a comprehensive and compliant experience. You need to have an understanding based in the community of what's broken, and together understand how to fix it, and then use your experience that you've earned by all of this work to create something that's really exciting.
What you said before really resonated as well. You were kind of saying that as you moved through your own life experiences, you couldn't look away.
Mm.
And that's kind of been my own experience because I have a number of different autoimmune conditions myself. My sister has cerebral palsy. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, and we were always kind of that family that for a long time we sort of just accepted would be excluded as standard. And then kind of over time you realize that's not necessarily the case. We just need to be making sure that those who are creating and innovating can kind of consciously invite different perspectives in. But what was interesting about that is that this theme this year at the Global Innovation Forum is life is a prototype. And so that kind of folds in so nicely with this idea that as we test and iterate, as we start creating briefs, and as we start to question whether our experiences are compliant or not, there's such a brilliant opportunity to kind of bring in those intervention points where you can invite in those different life experiences. Um, and that's kind of interesting, right? Given how many historically marginalized groups there are that just haven't made it into these decision-making processes.
And yes, and we are all part of one of those marginalized groups or more. Sometimes we are more than one. I am queer and old and chronic pain and dyslexic musician, and someone could call that probably the most dangerous of all of my disabilities. But all of these make up who I am.
Mhm.
And that's why I think it's so important that we use the social model of disability and social model of accessibility
Yeah.
versus the medical one. Because
Mhm.
now when you realize people don't need to be fixed. They just need to be understood and accommodated for. So now it becomes social. So having a disability isn't disabling if you have the right kit, if you have the
Mhm.
right solution. If you don't have the right solution, that's what causes the disability. But take a look at video games. Microsoft built the Xbox Adaptive Controller, a really brilliant piece of kit that sort of cracked open disability when it comes to gaming. And
Mhm.
at the same time, the Able Gamers charity came up with their accessible player experience, both at around the same time. And
Mhm.
what's really exciting is because of these two tools, video gaming has never been more accessible. They almost helped ignite this process of accessible gaming. So now people with physical disabilities can play games like they've never been able to before.
Mhm.
And now we're seeing competition between Sony and Microsoft, which is pretty cool. But also, designers are taking accessibility as a creative challenge as opposed to series of tick boxes. So in like 2019 or so, The Last of Us 2 was released, which is a first-person shooter game, and it was completed to the end unassisted by someone who's blind.
Yeah.
That's not compliance.
Yeah.
That is something that's just remarkable. And that thing that is like Ramagarawa says at the Helen Hamlet Center, if you design for the edges, you get the center for free. Everybody benefits because you never know when you're going to need the difference from tech bro to person with disability with severe disabilities. Everything in between becomes all of us.
Mhm. That's so. Do you know what? I'm also really. It's an incredible example, but I'm also refreshed to hear you reference the social model of disability because, without getting too far into the political or the politics of disability, there are some skeptics that kind of wonder whether it's a helpful model. And as you say, it's the model whereby we say that it is the world that we live in, our environments and experiences that disable individuals, not their kind of medical history or condition. And although there might be debate around that, I still think it's an incredibly helpful foundation of belief for creators and innovators because it then puts the onus on them to start to take positive steps to recognize barriers to these edge case users, as you would say. And I think, again, one of the kind of themes of the forum this year is to stay uncomfortable and to stay curious. And I think that's an incredible message, because we know that you probably have found this through your work and your experiences as well. People do feel uncomfortable with disability still. And even though we've had a few cool campaigns that have elevated representation, I still feel like we're quite far away from getting where we need to be in order to address that kind of systemic ableism in the creative process.
We are going to make a mistake. And
Yeah.
some of it has to do with fear. I might say the wrong thing. Well, you're going to get over it. I get yelled at if my app isn't accessible. Well, you're going to get over it. But what really helps is sincerity and transparency in the process. We're trying, we're learning, we welcome your feedback. It's that feedback mechanism is what's so important, and that's what feeds the creativity. I didn't know this is a problem, so now I get a cool thing that I get to fix now. And I respect my customers and my community enough to want to do that.
Yeah, and we've seen so many different brands who face into those challenges. And to your point, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once they're aware of some of these challenges, it's very rare that they kind of say, actually, do you know what? Let's not dig a little bit deeper. There's a willingness there once you see it to kind of try and work it out. And you at Google have got a number of different means of collecting feedback, don't you? You've kind of got quite open avenues for people, even on the website, to be able to feedback on whether something works for them or not.
Yeah, we as we design our products, we try to do layers of engagement with community. So we have Google's with disabilities. Our latest diversity annual report said around 6.5% of Google have acknowledged disabilities, and we all know that's low. But we also intentionally hired people in the community or highly trained experts in assistive technology to help us design our products. We have a role called the accessibility analyst. So we hired people because of their skills in assistive technology and the lived experience to help make our products better. We also partner with charities and organizations like RNID, RNIB, and we bring them in and we do testing like we've done here at the ADC. We test the products with the community, or we also have a group called the Trusted Testers, where we have people under NDA where we will share early versions of our applications or even hardware to make sure the community has a chance to see it and provide feedback early enough for us to be able to process it. And then even with all of that, the world is so big, we're going to make mistakes. So at the end, we have free support for people with disabilities in most applications. And it's web, it's ASL, it's Be My Eyes, it's chat, it's phone, many different ways of communicating with people. And you just have to go to g.co/disability support, find the times, make sure we're in your language, and then you get help. And then we can either teach you if you're making a mistake, or sort of aggregate a number of issues. Then we bring that back to the development team, and sort of back at the beginning of the process. So it's this again. We're not perfect. I make it sound like it's totally planned. It's a process. We make mistakes, but we have that process to try to bring the feedback in and make it better.
Yeah, but I think that humility is so important. And again, what I think is fascinating is you talk a lot. In fact, I think one of the things you said when I saw you last week, you kind of apologized slightly for levels of inaccessibility. It's evident that humility is what kind of leads you then to think, right, who are we listening to internally? Who do we need to listen to internally? How can we actively engage with experts externally? And then how can we give the world a kind of pipeline or a funnel that they can kind of feed back actively? That humility is so important, and that curiosity is important. And I think we need to see more of that from different businesses and different brands, because there's a kind of a tendency you can see from people to kind of, either think, right, we've ticked a box from a kind of campaign or comms perspective, and we're going to move on to something else now. But that ongoing willingness to listen is so important.
People want to feel like in charge of the destiny. People want to be experts in what they're doing, and that's cool. But do you want to be sort of the big fish in a small pond, or a big fish in a big pond? Yeah. And with 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the world, that's quite a market. Here in the UK, it's 24%, up to 24% of people with disabilities here in the UK. I was reading in the US, it's at least 13% according to the US Census. If you aren't paying attention to these these massive numbers of people, you're losing an application to sell your product, to sell your service, to change the lives of people. And that's why we do this. We're not here to make money, though that's nice. We're here to make a difference. That's why it's about innovation as opposed to banking.
And so when it comes to testing, not necessarily always nailing it, have you got any examples of failures that you're proud of or that you could talk about? Or something that's led you to something? Or you mentioned you had a product that didn't work. So, any other examples?
Well, I'll go back into past and to present. When I was at Apple, the first things I worked on was the G4 Cube, a very infamous piece of tech that was a Lucite box. And it was a really beautiful thing. Steve Jobs wanted to have this beautiful Lucite box. He was obsessed with cubes. And it didn't sell because it was underpowered and overpriced. Mm-hmm. So that's just simply from an innovation perspective. It was completely unique and new, but no one cared.
Yeah, so interesting.
So in terms of stuff that we're working here, a really neat example is our application called Lookout. It's an application that uses computer vision and optical character recognition to allow people who have visual impairments to engage in the world around them. Mm-hmm. And we started off with this really cool concept like, hey, I think computer vision can help people who are blind. Mm-hmm. And we made it from more like a computer science version, and the technology was visible in sort of the way the UI was built. And it wasn't based on the way a human uses the application. Sure. And it failed. But we knew there was something here. So we continued to invest and we made it better in version 2. And by the time we hit version 3, we had really partnered with the community and understood their needs. Mm. So that engagement, that inclusive design is what made something that was cool but not helpful into something that's actually quite useful.
Yeah. That kind of making sure that what you're creating is rooted in human truths is such an important part of it, and the tensions, what works for one person won't work for another. But it's funny, we see lots of brands kind of get excited about what they might be doing because they think they're creating a solution or a solve for people with disabilities, and then when it lands with the community it kind of falls flat because it's not based on need. So there's this imperative to make sure that you're always responding to and working with people that have got that first-hand experience.
You want to compete, but you also want to collaborate, because the way we do it, for example, when we're designing that disability support service that I mentioned a moment ago, we actually did this after consultation with Meta and Apple and Microsoft to ask them, what kind of support do you have? And Microsoft was really helpful. They gave us a lot of information that allowed us to be able to build and strategize what we could expect. So behind the scenes, we help each other because it's all about lifting the community. When it comes to our features, we'll compete tooth and nail. So for example, many years ago, we added live captioning into Android. And it's part of all of our applications, part of all of our versions of Android now. Almost most phones should have it today in many languages. Apple added it, I think, 2 years ago for the high-end phones, and they even use the same name because it's the right name. It's a live caption. So here's a situation where Apple took a feature idea from Google, but for example, we now have a digital magnifier. Apple had it first. I was jealous. And our friends at RNIB said, hey, but the Pixel camera is really cool. You should do this. And then we listened to them and we collaborated with RNIB to build the magnifier that sits on our Pixel phones. And because of our expertise in AI, it's not just a magnifier. You can also search for words and engage Google Lens and search and take what you've just taken a picture of and do a search based off of that. So you've taken the idea of magnifier, but we Googleized it and using the AI technologies that we've been working with for so long. We took something that is standard, a magnifier like Apple had, but made it ours. So we are inspired by the community, inspired by competition, and always strive to make things better. So different people are motivated by different things. Different leaders are motivated by different things. So for those people for whom altruism is really important, I may start with a disability case.
Sure.
Other people, I may start with brand. This is a brand reputation risk. Or coming from the US, there's a lawsuit waiting to happen if we're not careful here. or FOMO. So understanding the recipe of how to influence leadership is really interesting. And it's helpful, not just for disability, but for all aspects of things that aren't so ROI clear. It's hard to prove the value of taking into socioeconomic status or disability or race and gender into the development of a product. But if you're not intentional in terms of attempting these things, it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
How you bring that into your thought process, how you bring the breadth of humanity into what you want to build for, it'll never happen by accident. But you have to convince different people in different ways.
Yeah.
So this influencing exercise is a really interesting one. And sometimes I'll start with disability or I'll start with a curb cut. It's like here's something that's particularly impactful for disability, but here's how it can help everybody.
Yeah.
But if you're going to do that, you really want to make sure you nail the disability case first.
Yes.
You don't want to solve for everybody and then bring in, because it's really hard to narrow, because then those ROI conversations and those bean counters really don't like building a feature for a smaller group of people. They want to build larger. So this is another reason why you start larger, but make sure you nail the smaller.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've come across lots of different brands that might come and say, hey, we really want to do inclusive design, but look, I mean, what's the ROI given the number of people with Down syndrome or people with autism? And they almost kind of start with the number of people of a certain group, which is a kind of odd way to kind of begin. But
this is the McKinsey. This is what you're taught in MBAs, right? You're taught to find the most value, but the problem is if you value numbers, you don't value people. People aren't numbers.
To do a bit of mystic work, what emerging trends and technologies do you think are going to have the biggest impact on inclusive innovation in the next 5 years?
Well, in terms of technology, it of course, it's going to be AI. I hate saying that because my AI is probably different than other people's AI. I'm also really passionate about computer vision and machine learning and optical character recognition and all these things that help bridge physical senses into what a person can do. So if I have a good computer vision algorithm and ability to recognize the street and the words and my context, that's when things really get to be interesting. So my favorite thing that I'm dreaming of, and we're starting to see these things come together, is a pair of glasses that will help people with visual impairments and people with auditory, with hearing impairments, understand the world that's around them. Glasses, because it leaves your hands free. So you don't need to worry about someone knocking your phone out of your hand and stealing it, like happens way too often these days. But the glasses also provide stereoscopic vision and where you're looking at, so that matters. So I have these lenses into the world, and it can tell me where I am. But also it has microphones, so it can tell me what people are saying. And then, because it knows where I am and it knows my context, is if I'm going to take myself to Battersea Power Station, it'll also tell me where the coffee shops are because it knows I like coffee. And it also knows I prefer Black Sheep coffee over Pret. So it's going to take me to good coffee, or at least better coffee, and not lead me astray to Starbucks or something like that. So this AI, this context, this personalization, and then the ability to use something like a wearable to bridge the gap of sensory data, that's really exciting. It allows someone who is either distracted, with kids with visual impairments. Again, it's not just a disability thing. It's cut from the beginning. But these technologies really make it easy for the world to take in the world in ways that you didn't realize you needed the help.
What advice have you got for organizations to turn things like the EUAA compliance opportunity into innovation?
You got to do it. Do you want to do it kicking or screaming, or do you want to do it with some design and choice? It's really that simple. If your product or service is in scope, you have to do this. So do you want to have a good product or a bad product? That's up to you. If you are not necessarily in scope, but your competitors are doing it, they have an advantage that you don't. Supporting the people with disabilities in terms of brand, in terms of product quality, because of the thoughtfulness you go in terms of building a more inclusive product, makes a better product. So you can either decide to have a better product to compete with the competitors, or get this, be the first one out, be the one that sets the agenda against your competition, and you have that leg ahead. The usefulness of the legislation is a conversation starter.
Yeah.
And again, you can choose to do with it as you wish. If you have to sell, you have to sell, you have to do it. But you can make a beautiful product or a crappy product. That's your choice. And if you want to take the lead in your industry, if you want to create the most innovative product, the most useful product, that's what we're really here for. We're not here to, yes, we have to make money, but we want to change the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the world is a really big place. And when you have 16% of the world with a disability, that's a lot of people that might not be able to reach if you don't care. So you have a better chance from a business perspective to have a better product. You have a larger market, but most importantly, at least for me, as a heart-driven person, mm-hmm. you get to make the world we live in a better place, mm-hmm. and that matters. The rest of it will come as a matter of fact.
So there you are. Compliance is a springboard for transformation and a springboard for change. We have to see it as a creative challenge, not a challenge to creativity.